أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. This is our sixth episode of Introduction to Rijal Studies. Today we would like to discuss whether we can rely on later jurists and later scholars of Rijal when authenticating narrators and transmitters. We know that scholars of Rijal are divided into two categories, Al-Qudama and Al-Mutaakhirin. The early pioneering scholars of Rijal, who include Al-Kashi, Al-Najashi, Al-Tusi, Ibn al-Ghada'iri, Al-Barqi. These are all early jurists of Rijal, early scholars of Rijal. And then we have the Mutaakhirin. Mutaakhirin come 200 years later, after the pioneering scholars of Rijal. They come about 200 years later. The first of them is As-Sayyid ibn Tawus al-Hilli, Al-Allam al-Hilli, Ibn Dawood al-Hilli, and others. Those are known as Al-Qudama, these are known as Mutaakhirin. The Qudama wrote in Rijal, the Mutaakhirin wrote in Rijal. The early scholars of Rijal, they authenticated certain narrators. They said this person's weak, this person's reliable. And so did the Mutaakhirin, the later scholars. Now, what we've talked about previously is that we can rely on the early scholars of Rijal. Now, as for the later scholars of Rijal, and I mean by that Sayyid ibn Tawus, Al-Allam al-Hilli, and Ibn Dawood al-Hilli, Ibn Dawood al-Hilli. Can we rely on them when they authenticate certain narrators and transmitters, or they say that certain transmitters are unreliable? Al-Allam al-Hilli has his book Khulasat al-Aqwal fi Ilm al-Rijal. Ibn Dawood has his book Rijal ibn Dawood. Can we refer to their books? Do their books have any intellectual significance? Can we rely on them or not? There's a major debate among scholars whether we can definitely rely on the former jurists, the former scholars, the early pioneering scholars. But can we rely on the later scholars? There's a major debate. And someone who stood firmly and said we cannot rely on later jurists and later scholars of Rijal in the field of Rijal. When I say jurists, I mean in the field of Rijal. We cannot rely on them on the field of Rijal, is a Sayyid al-Khoi. Sayyid al-Khoi says that we can only rely on the pioneering early scholars, Al-Qudama. We cannot rely on the Mutaakhirin. Why? He mentions two major reasons. He says one is that the pioneering scholars, when they authenticate, when they tell us this transmitter is reliable or not reliable, they're not relying on their ijtihad. They know for a fact whether a transmitter is reliable or not reliable. How do they know for a fact? Because their period is close to the period of the Imams and Ahlul Bayt. These scholars lived right after the minor occultation, right at the beginning of the major occultation of Imam al-Mahdi, al-Ghaybat al-Kubra, at the beginning of al-Ghaybat al-Kubra. Some of them even towards the end of al-Ghaybat al-Sughra. So their time to the times of the Imams and the companions of the Imams is very close. While the later scholars, like Al-Allama Al-Hilli, Ibn Dawood Al-Hilli, Sayyid ibn Tawus, their teacher, they came 200 years, 250 years later. So automatically, these later scholars are actually relying upon whom? The former scholars. They're performing their ijtihad. They're, they don't know for a fact whether this narrator is reliable or not reliable. They're relying on their ijtihad. They're collecting proof and evidence, just like we're collecting proof and evidence. Right now, we like to know if this narrator or that narrator is reliable or not reliable. We have to collect proof and evidence. So too did Al-Allama and Ibn Dawood and the Sayyid ibn Tawus. They collected proof and evidence to know whether this narrator and transmitter is reliable or not reliable. While Tusi, this is according to Sayyid al-Khoi, while Tusi, Najashi, Kashi, and others, they didn't need to collect proof and evidence. They knew whether this transmitter was reliable or was not reliable. Hence, the first reason why we only rely on the former scholars, the early scholars, and we don't rely on the later scholars is that the first, they knew for a fact whether these transmitters were reliable or not, while the later scholars, they didn't know. They had to collect proof and evidence, just like we collect proof and evidence. So if they were performing ijtihad in knowing whether narrators are accepted, should be accepted or not, we are also performing our ijtihad. Why is their ijtihad more valid than ours? They are trying to reach the truth in Rijal. We are trying to reach the truth in Rijal. It's like two mujtahids. Can one mujtahid refer to another mujtahid? No. This mujtahid is essentially trying to reach God's law, and that mujtahid is trying to reach God's law. Why would one refer to the other and do taqleed of the other? They're both mujtahids. While Tusi and Najashi, they weren't mujtahids. They knew for a fact. Mujtahid, when I say mujtahid, I mean a person who's exerting an effort to try to reach the truth. While Tusi, he already had the truth. He already knew the truth regarding the transmitters and narrators. So too was Najashi. So that's one difference. The other difference is that there is a methodological problem in Allama's. There's a problem in Allama's methodology in authenticating certain narrators. This is again Sayyid al-Khoi's thesis. This is Sayyid al-Khoi's theory. He says, I can't rely on Al-Allama al-Hilli because there's a problem in Allama al-Hilli's methodology, and not just Al-Allama al-Hilli, but a bunch of these later scholars. They relied on something that is unreliable, that we cannot rely on. What is it? He says it's called asalat al-adala. That if there's a narrator, we don't know, was he good, was he bad, was he reliable, was he not reliable. No one authenticated him, and no one unauthenticated him. No one said that he's reliable, thiqa, and no one said that he's unreliable, da'if. So what do? By default, he becomes reliable, as long as he's a Shi'i, as long as he's Shi'i and Imami, a follower of Ahlul Bayt, by default, he's reliable. And nothing bad has been said about him. Nothing negative has been said about him and his character. Then by default, he is reliable. Asalatul adala. Not only is he reliable, but he's just. He's adil. Asalatul adala. Sayyid al-Khoi says that Al-Allama al-Hilli would rely upon asalatul adala when authenticating certain narrators. And there's no such thing as asalat al-adala. No one is by default reliable. To consider a person reliable, someone has to say so. One of the former jurists, one of the former scholars like Tusi Najashi has to tell us he's reliable. And if he's unreliable, someone has to tell us he's unreliable. There's no such thing as by default everyone's reliable or everyone's... In fact, if there's anything by default, it's that he's unreliable. He's unreliable. Being thiqah, someone has to tell us that he's a thiqah, he's reliable. Otherwise, we can't consider him by default as reliable, right? So this is called asalat al-adala. Sayyid al-Khoi says that because of asalat al-adala, because Allam al-Hilli accepts asalat al-adala, we do not accept Allam al-Hilli's authentications. Our view on this matter, our humble view on this matter, is that we can rely on both the former scholars, the early scholars, and the later scholars. Al-Qudama wal-Mutaakhirin. Why? I take you back to the reasons why we refer to a Rijali. If my dear students and brothers and sisters remember, we discussed why we refer to a Rijali. Is it because he's a transmitter and we rely on a reliable transmitter and he's telling us that this person is reliable or not reliable? Or is it because it gives us knowledge? Or is it because it gives us conjecture? Or what was it? We posed maybe 5 or 6 reasons, 5 or 6 theories of why we refer to a Rijali. And the one that we chose was the final one. And that was what? Rijali is Ahl al-Khibra. It's his specialty. It's his area of expertise. And people refer to the people of expertise. They refer to the experts in every field. We refer to doctors because they are the experts in medicine. We refer to lawyers because they're the experts in law, and so on and so forth. Why do we refer to a Rijali? Because he's the expert in Rijal. So it's all about expertise. If a former scholar is an expert in Rijal, and a later scholar is also an expert in Rijal, Allam al-Hilli is an expert in Rijal. Ibn Dawood is an expert in Rijal. He has his expertise, he's done his homework. He has his manuscripts, he has his books. He's done his homework in Rijal. He's an expert in Rijal. Someone who's a non-expert in Rijal, why can't he refer to a person like Al-Allam al-Hilli who's an expert in Rijal? So our justification for referring to scholars of Rijal is that they are experts. They're the experts of the field. And so if Allama is an expert, just like Najashi and just like Tusi, we can refer to both. Having said this, this debate might not be that fruitful, because whenever there's an authentication from a later scholar, there's usually an authentication from a former scholar as well. Let me give you an example. Let's take a narrator like Muhammad ibn Sinan. Muhammad ibn Sinan was a contemporary of Imam al-Sadiq, very debatable, very controversial figure. Some say he's authentic, he's credible, and others say he's not credible. When you come to Muhammad ibn Sinan, you will see that both the former scholars addressed him. Some authenticated, some didn't. and the later scholars addressed him as well. It is very rare that you'll see a narrator ignored by the former scholars but addressed by the later scholars. This is very rare. So it's uh, uh, it's very rare where you'll see that the former scholars ignored this narrator while you'll be in need of referring to a later scholar. Now let's say, and I'll end this discussion with this last point. Let's say that there's a narrator that was, for example, authenticated and said as reliable by the Qudama, but the Mutaakhirin, they deemed him as unreliable. For example, Shaykh al-Tusi says regarding Muhammad ibn Sinan, thiqa, he's reliable. But Al-Allam al-Hilli, regarding Muhammad ibn Sinan, says da'if. Whose word do we take? Whose word do we take? Do we rely on a former scholar or on a later scholar? When it comes to Sayyid al-Khoi, for example, he says it's simple. We take Tusi's word because Allama's word isn't even reliable. We don't even refer to the later scholars of Rijal. We don't even need to see what they say. We'll just immediately take what the former scholars say. But what we said is that no, we could rely on former and later scholars of Rijal. But what if they conflict? What if they conflict? Here, there's a general law. And this law will help us in different places, and we can apply it in different places. Why do we refer to a Rijali scholar? Because he's the expert in Rijal. When experts disagree with one another, who do you rely on? Rational people, who do they rely on? The most knowledgeable, the one with the most expertise. So let's say you refer to two lawyers. You have a case. You refer to two lawyers. One lawyer recently graduated. He recently joined a firm, and he's been working for 5 years. And there's another lawyer who's been in the field for 25 years. He's an established lawyer. He's more knowledgeable. He has more expertise. Of course, the number of years doesn't necessarily entail more knowledge. But let's just say that the more experience you have, the more knowledge you have. Let's just say. And they conflict. The younger lawyer, the one with less experience, says one thing. The one with the more experience says another. Who are you going to rely on? Obviously, the one with more expertise. It's the same thing with Rijal. You will rely on the one with the most experience, the most expertise in the field. And here, who has more expertise? The former scholar or the later scholar? Obviously the former, because they're closer to the time of the Imams and Ahl al-Bayt and their companions. Here, Shaykh al-Tusi would be seen as more knowledgeable in Rijal than Al-Allam al-Hilli. He would take the word of Al-Allam. Not only that, even when we look at the former scholars of Rijal, if they conflict one another, and does that happen? Absolutely. Tusi and Najashi, they were contemporaries. In fact, they were classmates. They studied together. You see Tusi authenticate one narrator, while Najashi rejects that narrator. Who do we take? Whose word do we take? Here, again, there's a debate. Some say they conflict and we take neither one. Some say we take the one that says he's unreliable and we ignore the one that says he's reliable. Why? Because the one that says he's reliable, he hasn't seen anything bad from that narrator. While the one that says he's unreliable, that means he's seen something bad. Others say we refer to the most knowledgeable. And here, Najashi is more knowledgeable than Tusi, for example. And we'll talk about this later on. Why? Because Najashi was only a Rijali expert. He wasn't a jurist. He didn't study fiqh or usul or tafsir or anything else. He, you know, he mastered the science of Rijal and nothing else. While Tusi was a faqih, he was a master in fiqh, in usul al-fiqh, in tafsir, in the Arabic language, and so on and so forth. And who is usually more precise and accurate? The one who masters one knowledge only, or the one that tries to master several sciences? Who will be more accurate? Obviously, the one that's mastered in one science, because he's not distracted with anything else. He's devoted his life to that science, that knowledge. Usually, he will be more accurate than the one that tries to major in everything. Right? It could be the case where that person is more knowledgeable, but usually it's this person. So Najashi would be deemed more knowledgeable than a Shaykh Al-Tusi. Now, as long as we're talking about the later scholars, and primarily Al-Allam Al-Hilli, because Al-Allam Al-Hilli has his Khulasat Al-Aqwal. In Khulasat Al-Aqwal, Al-Allam Al-Hilli quotes Ibn Al-Ghadairi a lot. Who is Ibn Al-Ghadairi? We will talk about him later on in the book. In our lessons, we'll talk about him thoroughly, but very briefly right now. Ibn Al-Ghadairi was a contemporary to Shaykh Al-Tusi and Najashi. He was a classmate to these two. And all three of them, they were experts in Rijal. They studied Rijal together. In fact, Ibn Al-Ghadairi, his father Al-Ghadairi, was a well-known scholar of Rijal. And these three, Tusi, Najashi, and Ibn Al-Ghadairi, Ahmad ibn al-Hussein, they studied under Ahmad's father, Al-Hussein ibn Ubaidillah al-Ghadairi. All three of them wrote in Rijal. All three of them, they have books in Rijal. Ibn al-Ghadairi, he had apparently several books in Rijal. But as Shaykh Al-Tusi, in his Fihrist, in the introduction to his Fihrist, which is a book that lists, it's a bibliography of Shi'i books. He lists those who authored from the Shia, and he listed their books, and he listed his sanad, his isnad, to the names of those books. How does he know that this person has a book? He says, so and so told me from so and so, from so and so, from so and so. So he lists his ways and his isnad. And then sometimes he authenticates some of them. He says, kana thiqatan, thiqa, or he says da'if. This person was reliable or unreliable. Anyway, Shaykh Tusi, in his introduction to his Fihrist, he says that Ibn al-Ghadairi wrote a couple of books in Rijal, but after his death, and he died at a young age, Ibn al-Ghadairi, his heirs, apparently his children, they took those books and they destroyed them. They either buried them, or they burnt them, or they ripped them apart. Why? Now that's an interesting case as well. That's we'll discuss that thoroughly when we discuss Kitab Ibn al-Ghadairi, Rijal Ibn al-Ghadairi. But briefly, Ibn al-Ghadairi had a very extreme sort of methodology in disqualifying a lot of the narrators. His book, that even today there's copies of it, but we don't know how reliable that copy is, because we've been told that his books were destroyed. His heirs, they destroyed his books. So how did that book, one of those books, it reached us today? We have it today. How did it reach us? We don't exactly know. But after saying that book, he disqualifies many qualified narrators and transmitters that are deemed reliable by others like Tusi and Najashi, Ibn al-Ghawa'iri will come and say, he's not reliable. Not reliable, not reliable. Ghulu, Mughali. And sometimes he would have a sharp tongue towards certain narrators. That this person was a deviant. And he might even curse him. La'natullahi alayh. What a deviant, what a... Perhaps his heirs, they felt that this is inappropriate. This is not an appropriate way of addressing some of the companions of the Imams. Although it was for a noble cause, because this is ilm al-Rijal. This is what preserves our hadith, to see who is reliable and who is not reliable. But perhaps they felt ashamed and they burnt those books. They did away with those books. Al-Allama Ibn al-Ghawa'iri was a contemporary of a Shaykh al-Tusi and a Shaykh al-Najashi. Al-Allama al-Hilli, 200 years later, in his book Khulasat al-Aqwal, he quotes Ibn al-Ghawa'iri. For example, he'll tell us this narrator is reliable or not reliable, and then he'll support his claim by saying, Ibn al-Ghawa'iri said this, Ibn al-Ghawa'iri said that. The question is, how did Ibn al-Ghawa'iri's book reach Al-Allama al-Hilli? How did it reach him? Those books apparently were burnt. They were burnt. Or they were buried. Or they were destroyed. How did it reach Al-Allama al-Hilli? So this is a problem. 2, Al-Allama al-Hilli's teacher, Sayyid ibn Tawus al-Hilli, he has a book in Rijal, and in his introduction he says that I have an isnad, I have a chain of narrators to all of the books of Rijal by the former scholars, Tusi, Najashi, Barqi, Al-Kashi, and all of them except Ibn al-Ghawa'iri. I don't have a chain of narrators. I found the book. I just found the book. I don't have a chain of narrators. This is the Sayyid ibn Tawus, the teacher of Al-Allama al-Hilli. Ibn Tawus says, I don't have a chain of narrators. I found the book. Al-Allama al-Hilli, if his teacher doesn't have a reliable chain of narrators to the book, meaning the book was not passed on to him from scholar to scholar to scholar to scholar until it reached his hand. No, he just found it. And how reliable is that when you just find a book? Today, we shouldn't compare those times to our times. Today, when we find a book, it's published, it's edited. You know, that book is reliable because today we have publishing houses, we have editors that edit the book. Previously, there was no such thing. Books were not even published. People would just copy books. I would find, for example, Shaykh al-Tusi, his teacher would give him a book. Shaykh al-Tusi would copy the book on his own, in his own notebook, and give the book back. Sayyid ibn Tawus says, I found the book. I discovered the book. Al-Allama al-Hilli, how did he find the book? If it's the same way that Ibn Tawus found the book, then obviously that's not reliable. So my point is that Al-Allama al-Hilli, if when he quotes Ibn al-Ghawa'iri, we cannot rely on those quotes. And I will end here, and we will meet you in another episode, inshaAllah. Sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.